Hey, it's Tech. Welcome to Off the Cuff. I'm back on my couch today, and I wanted to talk to you about why computers fail. Now, this seems like a little bit of a broad topic or something that's not really answerable, but I can tell you, having worked with computers for many years, that you can eke out quite a lot of life out of a computer. And if you set it up and work with it right, it will last a lot longer than most people are throwing them out. And there's ways of breathing new life into it, and I might talk about that in a different video. But today I wanted to focus specifically on why do computers fail. Now, my personal laptop, which I use for YouTubing, for creating YouTube videos, all the animation and the writing and everything that I do here at home, as well as work on occasion, it's failing. Now, it's not failing. I can still write documents and I can still browse the web, and I'm going to be able to do that for probably another year and a half, maybe two, if I treat it right. But for my professional applications, for animation, for video editing, for video compression, for data transfers that needs high security, it's failing. Its ports aren't communicating properly with external drives. It locks up and crashes and has corrupted multiple file systems on my external drives, which is a problem because I store all my YouTube information there and I don't want to lose it. But there's literally nothing I can do about it because it is simply the wear and tear on the hardware. Now, if you go and Google, you're going to find a lot of people saying like, oh no, there's no such thing as wear and tear on the hardware if you're not using a hard drive or your fan's not failing. I'm going to tell you that's wrong. There's actually really strong evidence in long-term situations of wear and tear, and I'm going to tell you about how that happens and why there's, well, frankly, nothing you can do about it, but ways to kind of mitigate and reduce your odds of having that kind of hardware failure. Most hardware that you buy falls into kind of one of three classes. You have your very basic consumer hardware, which is your lowest, your cheapest, your entry level. It's made for just light, occasional use. You just go and it just works. It's great. For light, normal use, you should be able to get about 3 to 7 years of life out of that hardware. 3 is a very rare. It's more like 4 to 7 years or 5 to 7 years if you don't screw things up on the software side, which is really easy to do, and I'll mention in a minute. But that's an important thing to know for your computers, is that you can get more life out of them than what marketing people want to tell you. If it's feeling slow, there's things you can do to fix that. But eventually it will wear out. Mid-range hardware lasts a lot longer. It's made for moderate usage. You can do a lot more with it. Photo editing, video editing to a degree, but not all the time. Some video gaming, but not all the time. And you can push that hardware a little bit longer. And if you do that, it can last usually 4 to 5 years without any significant problems. Professional hardware, on the other hand, is made for always on. It will be there 100% for 3 to 4, maybe 5 years, and then it'll just fail. But it's made for enterprise applications, for servers. Most of the computers that you're actually connecting to and talking to over the web are running pro-level hardware that is made to last and always be working, so that things, work. But it also wears them out faster, and it costs a lot more to make and manufacture. But eventually, every limit or every computer's limit is reached, and the hardware actually wears out. Now, it actually starts wearing out right out of the box, but hardware manufacturers are really conservative, and when they make it and when they tune things like clock cycles or voltages in the computer itself, they usually are very conservative. So about the first 3 years of life, or we'll talk about just general, I'm going to go with a mid-range computer. For the first 3 years, you're really not going to get genuine performance degradations from the hardware. Everything is kind of settling in. If it doesn't fail right out of the box, it's going to fail very close to the end of its life cycle instead. The basic idea is that as it degrades over time, in the first few years, you're still well within the tolerances, so you're not going to notice it. But you are going to notice software errors. So accumulation of soft errors, which I'll talk about in a different video, can kind of affect the way that your computer runs. You can get little glitches here or there. You can install stupid software because you've clicked on a link on the internet don't do that. And your antivirus isn't working, you can get viruses, you can get other things on your computer that just clog it up and make it feel a lot slower. Simply wiping it every year or every year and a half and reinstalling the operating system from scratch, reinstalling all your software from scratch, removing anything that you don't need, getting rid of any manufacturer installed software. So like if you're not using Apple hardware, if you're using like an HP or a Dell or a Lenovo or one of the other PC manufacturers, they usually come bundled with a shit ton of software. Oh, sorry, I need to edit that. That's the first time, yay. They come with all of this other software that doesn't really do the best things for your computer. And I'm sorry to the hardware manufacturers, but you should not be doing that. It's great for them and for their branding, and it helps them encourage you to upgrade, but it's really not good for the user experience. And the first thing I do usually is just to wipe all that software out and put on, the proper base Windows install, just the drivers, just the things that I need to get it to work at the base level, because otherwise it can just clog up the system. So wiping it and reinstalling it is a great way of getting rid of software errors and making things feel fresh and new, especially if you're already using an SSD. Otherwise, switching out your hard drive for an SSD will just make your computer fly. It's a relatively inexpensive upgrade. We're talking about $150 to make a $1,000 computer work almost like brand new. It's so simple. It's so easy to do. I would highly recommend that to make your computer feel like new if the other hardware components aren't still or are still working and your computer's in the 3 to 4 year range. That's a really great, really cheap upgrade. Also put in as much RAM as you can. Again, you'll probably need to talk to a professional if you don't know how to do this stuff yourself, but it'll really make your computer, your old computer feel brand new. In terms of physical errors on your computer, there's a lot of points that can actually fail. The first and foremost is your hard drive. It is the most high-risk component in your computer for failure. Other than your fans, which are inexpensive and easy to replace, your hard drive, which stores all of your information, is the only other part with moving parts. Everything else is electronic. It's mechanical, right? It's got spinning disks inside, and you have these heads that move across the platters over and over and over again, retrieving and getting information. And most consumer-grade hard drives, again, not enterprise-grade, they're made for 100% uptime, but consumer-grade hard drives with continued and extensive use, they wear out over time. Again, they usually fail right out of the box or within 3 years. So switching out the hard drive, or knowing that in about 2.5 to 3 years you can switch out the hard drive to make things run faster, is a really great trick to kind of offset the initial and early failure. That also means you should have backups, because your hard drive is the first place that's going to fail. Switch it out for an SSD if you can. The second place that's usually going to fail is your fan. Again, for that reason that it has moving parts. Anything that has moving parts is going to wear out simply from the mechanical stresses. Things are built with tolerances, which means you get tiny vibrations, you get little bits of wear and grinding of parts, and that wears them out. They start slipping, they stop reading things right, and hard drives, even though they're theoretically supposed to have this smart status which warns you when it's going to fail, they don't. They just fail. I've never seen it where the smart status has given me enough time to actually back up or fix the hard drive. It's more like, oh look, I'm about to fail, and I'm done. So not a good idea. Just keep those. If you do video editing or video gaming, expect to replace your hard drive once every 1.5 years. This is why I edit on external drives. So if you're video gaming or editing, it destroys a drive a lot faster than anything else that you can do. And I really, really want to emphasize that. The amount of reading and random access that you're doing, it just keeps that drive spun up for so long that the parts wear out a little bit faster. And that's the case with all of these things, is the more work you make it do, the faster it wears out. And that range is going to be different for the consumer, mid-range, or professional grade hardware, simply because of how it's constructed and the tolerances involved. So you have used your hard drives. Those fail in about a year and a half. They're relatively inexpensive to fix, but you just have to be careful because if you lose it, and that's the only place where your information is stored, you can lose all of your information. So backups, important. Next place that's most common to fail is your connectors. So your USB ports, if you're doing a lot of, plugging in, changing this, moving that around, or your FireWire on the older computers, or Thunderbolt if you're using a newer computer or a Mac, those ports fail. You have this mechanical stress. Every time you put the connectors together, you basically have these mechanical pins on the one side that push down, and they physically bend when you slide the second connector in, which is why they're able to make contact. Now, these contact patches will wear out. They grind against each other, right? You have a mechanical stress on the actual piece of metal, which can fatigue and break, or you'll get corrosion. Now, a lot of connectors are gold-plated to reduce corrosion, but they can still break. You can still get corrosion, which increases the resistance, and it gets to the point where your host, your computer, can't actually power your peripherals. You can tell because what will happen is you can only use powered peripherals. Like if you plug in a little passport drive that powers off of the computer, it won't power on. You have to use externally powered drives or externally powered peripherals, so that bus power can go away, and that's partially what's going on with me, but it's actually a failure in a different part of the computer system, which I can't replace. But anyway, so watch your connectors, watch for broken pins, don't try and force things together, and that can help them last a lot longer. Again, if you can externally power things versus bus powered things, that's a really great fix and a really important thing you can do to help your connectors last longer. Next, your battery. If you're using a laptop, your battery is going to fail probably within 2 years. It's just the way that it works. Macs tend to last a little bit longer, but the lithium ion or lithium polymer, most are lithium ions, lithium polymers are a little too volatile. But the lithium ion batteries that are in your computer, if you've ever seen, go Google some scanning electron images of what a battery looks like during a recharge cycle. When they start, when they're fresh, they're all nice and organized. The electrodes are really, really stable. They have uniform crystalline shapes. As they recharge over and over and over again, they lose capacity because that nice crystal structure becomes this random, oriented, bulging, growing tree with too much gaps, too many holes in it, and they don't hold as much charge. So theoretically, your device should actually compensate for that and start reporting newer battery times, but your battery will go slowly down. But in my experience, they're not perfect, and suddenly you can jump from like, oh, hey, I'm at 15% and it's off because it didn't realize that, or it'll work and work and work and work, and then one day it just won't hold a charge. So replacing the battery on a Mac, you're going to have to go to the Mac store. On a Windows machine, you can usually get a good aftermarket battery. Be really careful with anything coming out of China. They have less rules there, and they don't always put in the right power regulation, which can actually damage it. One brand, by the way, that I really like is Anker. If they make one for your laptop, I actually put that in my Windows laptop while I was still using it. They are an American company, and they have a really, really good success rate with batteries. I like their products. I'll talk about them on a different day, maybe, or not, whatever, if they want to sponsor me. So batteries, they lose their charge and voltage over time, and it's one way they fail. Power supplies that actually power the computer, your resistors and your capacitors will wear out. Over time, little imperfections can get accentuated because of heat or because of just the random nature of the way that the electricity is moving. And you can get capacitors that short circuit inside, or you can get resistors that burn out and stop resisting, and that can change the power characteristics. And your power supply can go, if you're using a tower computer, always check that. If the computer doesn't turn on, try a different power supply. It's probably the power supply. But if you're using good quality, solid power, not many spikes, not much need for additional regulation, usually your power supplies can last between 3 to 5 years. But again, it's an inexpensive component that can be replaced rather than replacing the whole computer. Now, let's talk about the ones that if they break, you're kind of screwed. They're called integrated circuit failures, specifically your field effect transistors. The field effect transistors, metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors, MOSFETs, are what make up the core of your central processing unit, your CPU, and they make up the core of how your RAM works. Again, for your CPU and RAM, as well as for your graphics card and its RAM. These failures theoretically, happen. They do, and they wear out over time. This is where you get some confusion on the internet. There's a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about who will tell you, oh no, they don't really wear out, they'll just break at one point. But the actual International Organizations for Electrical Engineers, the IEEE, they have done measurements and have found that they wear out over time, and they wear out in specific ways. Basically, what you have is a floating gate that when you pass charge through creates an electromagnetic field that influences a semiconductor underneath it. And what happens is you can start getting problems in the region that separates them. You will get ions that start moving in from the top and the bottom, increasing its resistance and its absorbance of electricity, which means you need higher voltages to actually get the same charge. You can get little pockets that start appearing in there that are electrically conductive and short circuit, which affects the performance of the transistors. You can get, what else can you get? You can get short circuits from what are called whiskers. Basically, the tiny nano-thin wires that are connecting these different transistors inside your CPU can grow little filaments, and everything is packed so tightly together that they can short circuit the circuits, and you will start having errors. Lastly, you'll get these things, you'll get a thinning called upstream thinning, where these wires where the charge enters, because it's almost always going in one direction, starts to thin because metal ions are pulled with the electricity down the line, and that thinning increases the resistance. All of this, by increasing the resistance, changes the clock frequency of the core. It increases latency, which means it takes longer for it to accomplish the same number of tasks. It takes longer for it to go through that transistor, through that cycle. And what that does is it either increases the errors, or you have to slow down the frequency rate in order to be able to get the same reliability. That usually you start seeing that usually after about 3 years of intense use. And that's where my computer is now, is after years of intense use, things are slowing down. And there's nothing you can do about it other than replacing the chips or the motherboard. And if you do that, it's basically, you might as well be buying a new one, because the chips and the motherboards at that point are so old that if you're trying to do performance, you really need to get something new. So your CPU, if that happens to your RAM, by the way, it's easy. You just pull it and plop it back in. If it happens on your graphics card, that's a relatively inexpensive fix unless you're on a laptop. But if it is your CPU or your motherboard, you're kind of SOL. There's really not much you can do other than replacing the whole computer. With that, the motherboard also suffers from the same problem as the power supply, where resistors and where the resistors and the capacitors can wear out. And when that happens, usually the motherboard just goes. There's not much you can do about it. Or the little button battery will leak. That's a bad thing. It'll start short circuits everywhere, and you get really big problems. Anyway, so when computers fail, that's what happens. And this is a really bad outro. I'm really tired. But if you treat a computer right, it will last you a lot longer than you think it will. So that's my little lecture on why computers fail. I hope you've learned something and maybe can keep your computer running a little bit longer, because they're expensive to replace and I don't have one in the budget. But I will make it happen because I want to keep making YouTube videos. And anyway, till next time, I'm Tech Adams, saying keep thinking, and thanks for watching.